side you get benefits that you don't on theirs, right? Secondly, they tell you that, look, you get this net negative for the women who are affected by these situations. Firstly, in terms of like the vigilantes themselves, that they have to internalize some sort of guilt or harm when they're violent against other people. I think recognize that these people that they're like doing this justice for are like, they're literal personal attackers. These are people who have raped them. I think if anything, like they don't necessarily internalize guilt, maybe it makes them feel better about their situation, and if that's the route that makes them feel better about that situation, we're perfectly fine with that being the case, right? I don't think you necessarily internalize guilt when someone who has maybe like raped and killed your sister, and you are able to like be able to some extent get revenge on that situation, right? But furthermore, they tell you that, look, violence are coercive. Women either have the option to like not join the system, or join the system and internalize this harm and guilt, right? I don't really think that's the dichotomy that exists there, but furthermore, I would tell you that a lot of times these vigilantes themselves are like a group of women who have already to some point opposed or broken the patriarchy and are willing and actively willing to fight for the situation that could represent like a broader group of women who are all being affected within this community by this type of violence against them, right? And they tell you, look, you don't get like legal protection on their side of the house. So like I've already told you, that doesn't serve to help them in the first place. Furthermore, a lot of these acts already exist so far outside of the law that you're not able to like pull them into a proper court situation where people can like subpoena each other or like, have it caught on tape. Like that's just not a system that exists for this to be able to solve properly legally, right? So we tell you essentially, they tell you, look, we can use systems like Islamic feminism that already exist, that don't have backlash, that aren't actively opposing the men in the area. We tell you this: Islamic feminism in South Asia has gained some concessions for getting social and economic benefits, but domestic violence and sexual assaults are still at an all-time high. And the reason for this is because feminist movements in these regions have to like pander to the patriarchy and powerful men, and therefore men are never sufficiently punished for this type of violence, right? Because the way that they get these concessions from them is by appeasing them in that sense, right? We think under like their current situation, there is no way in which these women actually get justice, or no way that these men actually get punished for these types of actions, these morally abhorrent actions that they've chose to commit against these women who have been harmed essentially for the rest of their lives, that have to view themselves as lesser beings for the rest of their time on this earth, right? We think that's damage that needs to be repaired to some extent on our side of the house. They don't give you any mechanism as how that like internal feeling of worthlessness is solved on opposition. We think that's something really important that you need to consider in this round, right? So ultimately, what we want you to take away from opening government is that recognize for these individual women who have essentially had their lives and self-worth torn apart, we need some sort of mechanism in place that we support in order for them to regain some sort of value within their own lives. And we would say that this ultimately is when you oppose the patriarchy, when you say, look, listen to us now when we are fighting for justice, because you won't listen to us in your legal and your religious and your political systems. This is how we get that attention. This is how you get change for these individuals. And this is how you make these women be able to feel like humans again. Thank you.
Deputy Prime Minister, Paul Deputy.
Okay, Judge's turn. Honorable Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister gets up here and tells you that the problem with something like Islamic feminism is that it panders to men and that it works with allies in the region. The truth is, that sort of trade-off is inherent to literally any movement in which you want to have an alliance of more than one person. You will always make trade-offs. The question is about which ones are in the best service, your way to protect your time longer. So, what we're having over here is the idea that they simply want to run the most radical version possible, which will have backlash. First of all, this is around about the hard choices. It is not merely enough for opening government to get up here and set desirable impacts. They must engage with the comparative of the mechanisms. Chris and I are also perfectly happy to contest the idea that things are getting worse. In fact, domestic violence rates, most experts agree that they are getting lower in places like Southeast Asia, where you have things like Islamic feminism. The difference is that we are having more reporting, and so these things are gaining more prominence. This is an information bias that when we hear about it, we think it's higher. Don't buy that coming out of opening government. So, 4 points of direct rebuttal, followed by constructive, followed by comparative. on the first point. So they get up there, they get up here and talk about uniqueness. Okay, first of all, violence is not likely to deter these people precisely because they are motivated by an ideology of sexism. They're not going to get up here and say something terribly discriminatory about like ethnicities or religions there, but I will say that the individuals who perpetrate these crimes, it's not a mystery, it's because they firmly believe that women are worse. If you truly believe that, the odds that you are deterred by violence, slim to none. This is not a rational calculus, and so they're never going to get any solvency on deterrence. Additionally, as Chris said, permanence is not unique from other kinds of physical violence, and is certainly not unique to what's happening here. No. 2, on this idea of collective action solvency, and then on her lists a bunch of bad things that happen to women in these reasons. Okay, first of all, they probably only win the collective action bit if they win solvency. Chris talks about why not. I'll talk to you about some more about what they don't. But also then his other things don't link. Right? He talks to you about the economy, but the root cause of the economy and of women being shut out of the economy is not rape. It's the kind of narrative that they bite back into on their side of the house, that women need to be put in their place, that women are inferior, etc., etc. And then they say, well, it's getting worse. Okay, look, Islamic feminism and things like that are our counterprop. Chris and I would rather support gradual, sustainable change that will win out in the long term over the kinds of rash, radical policies that will lead to backlash and are a band-aid solution at best on their side of the house. No. Additionally, what Chris and I will tell you is that these are things that we exert more pressure on these governments for. Inasmuch as they make that worse and foreclose our ability to exert pressure through legitimate systems and build up those kinds of legitimate systems in the long term, they're bound to lose this round. Do or die is not good enough if you know you're going to die. That's the thing they need to engage with in their framework. 4, on justice. No. So, a couple points on this. The first is that, okay, they laugh off this idea that to physically harm someone means that you internalize a certain amount of psychological damage. That's probably true. It's not the most important thing around, but it's certainly mitigating their claims about catharsis. But secondly, this probably means that more violence doesn't actually fix. Maybe it makes you feel better in the moment, but it does not fix in the long term, and at the point at which it trades off with the other kinds of benefits that Chris and I are bringing you, it is absolutely worse. Additionally, what this means is that if you are one of these women who carries this out, you probably become more psychologically damaged because you must constantly watch your back, waiting for revenge on your revenge on your revenge on your revenge, instead of trying to push for something through the law. Finally, on this justice point, the law matters because pushing for it is the best kind of long-term solvency you can hope for. Chris and I tell you this is the biggest impact in this round precisely because it is what matters to the largest number of people. Okay, constructive, how this interacts with international perceptions of feminism. Closing.
Yeah, okay, so if you want to talk about trade-offs, you have to first prove to us why we're trading one thing for another. I have no compelling reason to believe that Islamic feminism cannot continue to exist in a world where now vigilantism is pushing for their agenda to be taken more seriously by the regime. All these things, like putting people in their place, are predicated on self-interest. If my self-interest is threatened, I will act.
Conveniently, this is my constructive. So let's get right into it. So, 4 points on constructive and how this interacts with the international feminist movement. The first is that the international feminist movement is a key ally for resources in general. They are the ones who are truly most likely to care about you. They're the ones who are going to give you money, going to give you media coverage, etc., etc. And they are also key for legitimacy. They have a substantial international brand that is best able to drum up public pressure and public interest, and they want to protect that brand. So, why this trade-off? The answer to his POI is that Chris already brought you the internal trade-off about how you foreclose moderate allies within these countries because you get them off with extremism. But also, the international feminist movement is going to back away from you. This happens because the cost of defending these actions that are viewed as extreme by most of the world, including domestically within those areas where they might want to push for more moderate change, but also in other parts of the world where this is not happening, is sky high at the point at which the feminist movement makes the most utilitarian calculus for a broad base of members. They are going to drop you when you are the most extreme. Thus, on their side of the house, what they are trading off with is moderates within the country. Nope, what they're trading off with moderates within the country, and they are trading off with the idea that you are able to get any sort of international leverage, which is the kind of thing that might exert pressure on these regimes to change. Regimes operate on a calculus of image, thus they're going to care about these sorts of things. This is perhaps the only solvency that will allow these people to care if you embarrass them on the international stage. In order to have the reach to do this, you must have the allies of the international feminist movement. Lastly, international feminist movements have reach in international governments. It's literally impossible to reach any of these other governments or any of these other groups or any of these other donors in isolation at the point at which you cut yourself off from them by painting yourself as so extreme that the opportunity cost to defend you is extraordinarily high. No. So, let's do the comparative in this round. So there are 3 big things here: the short term, the long term, and this idea of justice. I'll start with justice. So first of all, the point at which this forecloses other kinds of justice, because as Chris tells you, you take off pressure to push for these laws, and you say that the laws are defeatist, never going to work, they don't work, they can't work, etc., etc. You foreclose those other kinds of justice that are going to be more proportional, that are going to be more cathartic, that are going to be able to ensure your safety in the long term, etc., etc. Two, on justice, but you have a backlash within the country, you lose the moderates, and you end up further angering these individuals because you were pushing so extremely. You end up with a physical harm to yourself. It's not a question of, oh, you should never do anything to piss off the patriarchy, but it's a question of how fast do you push against whom. Literally killing people is a very extreme response. You can get better, more sustainable change with slower, more incremental pieces, and your right to catharsis brings fresh hell down on other women at the point at which you bite into all of these backlash things. You can never win this round on the basis that you as an individual would be more important than all of these other women. So, in the short term, as Chris tells you, because these individuals are violent and have a pattern of these sorts of things, you run a physical risk of re-victimization, which is perhaps the most traumatic thing that happened to these individual women, and you are coercing the women to do this because it becomes women's burden to fix this for themselves by taking a gun or a baseball bat or their male relative and going after them. That is horrifying. In the long term, it's worse for most women, it's worse for the movement because it foregrounds solvency and legitimate advocacy, and it's a band-aid solution at best. For all these reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
The deputy leader on this,
International feminism does not support this. This is what we get out of the last speaker, and regrettably, this means she did not read the context slide, which illustrated that international feminist movement is rallying behind this vigilante justice movement. I think that just illustrates the inherent flaw in their cases when they don't understand the context. They also say their counterprop is Islamic feminism. Please illustrate how this is going to work in Ireland, once again, which is illustrated in the context slide where it's like women in Ireland and Egypt are doing this, or supporting this. So how is this Islamic feminism going to work if you want to make this your great counterprop? Look, the reality is that violence against women is a global problem. It's not what they want to perpetuate, that it's somehow only in the Middle East. This is just racist Western thinking that all the problems against women are here. The reality is every minute in the United States, 8 women are sexually assaulted. Okay, like even if you want to look at your favorite like Nordic liberal democracies in like Norway or whatever, even they have massive rates of like sexual assault and rape. This is a global phenomenon, and we need a solution to a system that has completely failed wholesale. And I think our OG does an okay job of like illustrating this. But furthermore, let's get into this, because the main other arguments that like opposition has brought you so far is kind of like, you know, the 2 interesting points that violence perpetuates violence and like leverage doesn't work. These are interesting points, but I'll be getting into this interwoven within my speech itself. So on government side, we're very proud to tell you that, look, here's the thing. What happens when a system fails? What good does vigilante justice actually do?
Question?
And how can we actually lead to restoration of the identity of a woman herself? Because we are talking about the actor in here themselves, right? Let's start with the restoration of the identity. We have to look at what rape does, because rape is not a sexual act. Rape is an act of dominance. When you commit rape on someone or sexual assault, you are dominating yourself onto that person. You are making them into an oppressed structure in itself. What does this do? This strips the agency from that sexual assault victim, from that rape victim, and when that happens, they are an empty person who cannot live a normal life from that. It is very hard to illustrate, especially coming from a male, how this feels to anyone, and someone who has definitely not gone through that. None of us, unless you've actually gone through that, can truly illustrate what that type of psychological permanent damage looks like, and it's a fallacy for any of us to pretend like it is. The reality is we are restoring agency to the victims of violence, sexual assault, and rape by allowing them to take the master's tools and put this into their own hands. Take back the agency and fight against these oppressors. Vigilante justice is not about someone else, these bandit crews or whatever. We're talking about the victims themselves taking arms against their oppressors and fighting back against injustice. That's what we are talking about, and that's why we're proud to propose. Furthermore, let's talk about why systems fail. When a system fails, what we have in the status quo, government talks a little bit about this when we say that, like, you have implicit bias in the patriarchal system and everything. When a system fails, you have no obligation to support that system. Okay, we are totally okay with that hardline stance, because the reality is the status quo is so disgusting and so severe that our response must be hard in itself. Government has violated the social contract to its people. In the status quo, government takes on this burden of protecting you from harm. You, as an individual, before anything else, always have a prima facie duty to protect yourself. This is inherent Maslow hierarchy of needs. Me first, you cannot do anything else before you act on yourself. What happens in the status quo is the government is supposed to take on this burden. They are giving you the social contract that, look, you will complacent with our laws as long as we agree to protect you. And most governments are supposed to do this. But what we have seen time and time again across nearly every nation on the planet of the earth is that these governments have epically failed to do this, epically failed to provide this support and justice for women in this situation. No. And what we have is that because we have a system that has failed, you have a moral obligation to fight that system. What does this look like? This looks like what the Black Panthers did in the civil rights movement, right? The Black Panthers were a radical element of the civil rights movement. But why were they successful? Because they said, look, we're sick and tired of our black brothers and sisters being shot like no other, and there's no repercussion. We're going to arm ourselves and tell these cops, they want to shoot us like dogs, but we got guns, right? That's what they did right there. And when that happened, it forced the government to the negotiating table. They had to say, well, we don't want to support the Black Panthers because they're radical, but we will talk to this moderate movement. What the radical movement in any revolutionary movement does is it pushes the moderate to the forefront and perpetuates their compromise. At the end of the day, the Black Panthers get a win out of Martin Luther King's peaceful protest because they helped push him to the center by bringing the conversation radically to the left, to the right. Let's get into what good does vigilante justice do? Because what opposition seems to believe is like, look, vigilante justice is just violence on violence, it's just chaos, it's just catharsis. It's not that simplistic. Look, but we agree, vigilante does create violence and instability, and we are good. We like this. Because this is stepping in for a void that the government is not enforcing, the social contract that is being violated here. Private individuals are taking on government power here. This is an inherent power grab. They are taking on a duty. Go ahead.
Okay, if there is absolutely no government protection at the point when you put yourself in a more unstable situation, how is that not worse off for the individual?
It's not, because if you listen, we're giving them agency back to themselves. So when you have private individuals taking government power in this power grab, what this does to the government is forced to act because its power is being violated by its own constituency. When this happens, it forces people to compromise, and this is the big thing I want to illustrate, is this not this simplistic case that like opposition's going like, oh, you guys are just angry and you want to be violent or whatever. That's not what we're saying. We're actually giving you a plan on how this is going to effectively work in the system that has failed. What this does is it forces the government to the negotiating table. We can see this with the Black Panthers, right? They forced the government to negotiate with the reconciliation of the reality of a black man and woman in the United States. We can see this with the IRA in Ireland itself, right? The IRA was a violent, radical movement, but it forced the British government to come to the negotiating table because inherently power structures, when you are the dominant force, don't need to come to the negotiating table. Patriarchal structures don't need to come to the negotiating table and talk about harms to women because they are not intrinsically in that system. They are in the power structure. So we need to put power back into the hands of the oppressed, bring the oppressors to the negotiating table in order to actually create some sort of change. So what does this look like? In the best case, vigilante justice forces change within the system. The government comes, I've already illustrated, in a sort of compromise to the more moderates via the radicals, right? In the worst case, even if it doesn't work, the status quo is exactly the same. We still have violence against women, but we get a restoration of agency for victims of violence and some substance of restorative justice for these women. Proud to propose.
Member Government, call the member